year that labor truly does save the city of Los Angeles. 85%, I think, of all of the costs in the city on the general fund are salaries, our wages, our benefits, healthcare, etc. That's how the city delivers the vast majority of its services. If you think of it, police and fire and rec and parks and all the other assets we have as a city, it's primarily people that are delivering those services. And quite honestly, with the problems that we face, it's really labor that has is the biggest piece of the equation in the conversation, which labor stepped up because the cost of the early retirement was covered by the increased contribution to the early retirement program, right? It's the key part of the conversation. So that was the much of the big picture last year. I don't think it played out as well as it should have played out. It wasn't understood as well as it should. But this year, you're going to see the big picture in terms of, so I'm going to go through big picture what the crisis is. So can we get, okay, we'll do it one by one here. You have in front of you color for the first 50 people and black and white for the after the first 50. But first look at the final general fund deficit to solve that number right there. And I just want to walk you through why you'll hear different numbers and what the different numbers are based on. Right, so the estimated revenues are $4.3 billion. Estimated expenditures are $4.7 billion. Right, and so there's the $350 million deficit to be solved that was in the mid-year FSR, financial status report from the city chief administrative office or officer. Right, that's the $350 million number that you've often heard. In addition to that, there are other things that we've used to solve the budget in the past that were one-time solutions that we couldn't assume would be one-time solutions again. Let me just walk you through what those are. First one is that in this past year, we've, working with the Police Protective League, we were able to get $80 million in savings by going away from any kind of cash overtime for LAPD officers. Now, there's a downside to going away from cash overtime, because what happens is a police officer will do their normal beat, and then the next morning they have to be at court, right? And while they're at court, that's not part of their, say, their normal beat. If it's off hours, they would normally get paid overtime, cash overtime, to make sure that they would stay on the beat the rest of the time. What they've had to do is they've had to do what's called CTO time, or compensatory time off, to be able to take time off at a future moment when they're on the beat to make up for the time that they're, say, in court, which is where they spend a fair amount of their time, right, and other duties. So a loss of cash overtime, replacing it with CTO time or compensatory time off, is a reduction in the availability of having police on the beat. It's not a good thing, right? But that's the way it was solved last year in terms of $80 million in lost cash overtime. So that $80 million in lost cash overtime, is that how we're going to solve it this year? We would rather not solve it this year in that way, because that's a loss of services. So that $80 million is back on the table in the conversations with all of our employee organizations. The second one is $41 million in the modified coverage plan. The modified coverage plan, as you know, is a way in which there's sort of a rolling, kind of like a blackout, but a reduction of different trucks at different stations at different times. And it's managed to try to maximize the delivery of services, but it's a reduction in services, right? And so the UFLAC, United Firefighters of Los Angeles City, would say that there's potential increased response time. And there is potential increased response time, and we all know that potential increased response time is potential loss of life, right? So modified coverage plan is not the ideal solution, right? There are other solutions that could be better structured And so that amount of money that was saved last year to resolve the budget deficit is back on the table looking for a better solution this year. The next one is there's a $48 million that's built into the $350 million that came from the CIO's office, which is basically each year, in terms of new construction and some existing construction, 1% is set aside for infrastructure, infrastructure improvements, and maintenance on new structures. And we're not going to be able to afford to do that this year. We have never walked away from that before. We're going to walk away from it this year in what our proposal is. Right? It has bad implication as well, but that's what's going to, you'll see on Wednesday in the mayor's budget proposal. The 1% infrastructure maintenance fee, mostly for new construction, is something that is a choice we can make as a city. And in a crisis situation, we're feeling like that's the kind of choice that we will need to make this year to address our deficit. And then you have $48 million, then you have, so the adjusted deficit you see at $423 million, and then there's a revenue reduction from the financial status report beyond a reduction from what we were working with previously, which is $40 million, right? And that's not really a reduction in sales tax, but it is a reduction in the documentary transfer tax from what was projected. It's a reduction in utility users tax. So for example, how many people are getting rid of their phones in their homes right now? Their hard lines? Anybody? Guess what? That's a reduction in utility users tax. That's going to be an ongoing reduction that we as a city are going to have to live with as people are routinely shutting down their hard lines and just using cell phones only. Right? So there's an additional $40 million reduction in revenue projections that came in the FSR. Now that's been adjusted up a little bit, that you'll see on the other side of how we're going to solve this. But that gets you to the $463 million that we have to resolve in this year's budget. And the ways in which it's going to be approached and resolved is on the other side, which is you're getting a preview. You're getting as deep a preview as really has gone out anywhere right now of the budget that's coming out. At the $463 million in deficit that needs to be resolved in this year's budget, right? The way in which it's been addressed has been I think, thoughtful and kind of profound conversation within the city that's happened largely with the labor partners with the city about how it is that we're going to get through this period without significant additional reductions in services. And in fact, how can we bring back some of the services that we lost by doing the approach to last year's budget? Furloughs, for example. Are furloughs a reduction in service? Yes. Very much so. Right? Furloughs are not a great solution, but there are other ways to kind of resolve it. So if you look at the dark green color, that is the way in which people think about cutting structural deficits, which is basically reducing services and laying off individuals or sweeping positions that are currently open. So the big thing that's happened is we have a managed hiring process in the city. We don't backfill positions that are laid off that don't have revenue attached to them, unless it's an absolute necessity, an emergency. So it goes through a managed hiring process. You need complete agreement between the Chief Legislative Analyst's Office, the Chief Administrative Officer's Office, the CAO, the CLA, and the Mayor's Office all have to agree in order to be able to backfill a position that somebody who has left the city or transferred to some other department. Right? And so it's hard to get complete agreement from those three entities on the managed hiring process. Some happen, especially when they are revenue generating, right? Or especially when they're critical services for the city. Most do not. In the last year, there have been 1,600 people that have left an existing position, either leaving the city or going to another department. Those 1,600 positions are positions that have been largely swept in this year's budget. And so a bulk of the $100 million in structural savings that are permanent are coming from, again, the managed hiring process and sweeping the 1,600 positions. Some of those are general fund, some of them are special fund, right? And so we're not getting the benefit of this sweeping of the special fund positions. But there is, again, an opportunity to move people that are qualified to those special fund positions, and that is happening sort of naturally. In addition to that, other structural changes that have happened and are happening is there is a consolidation between the Treasurer's Office and the Office of Finance, right, which is the one major consolidation. There's a review process for the Personnel Department picking up personnel functions in some of the other departments, so a consolidation of some of the functions, right? You also have a percentage cut that each department has to find ways to address, right? And they can't address it through furloughs because the furlough conversations are happening with the bargaining units. It's not happening with departments. So their cuts that have to happen in department budgets, they have to figure out how to do it through a small reduction in services or in a layoff or through the loss of all sweep positions. So alley cleaning is actually going to go from street services as a general fund responsibility over to sanitation. And sanitation has some additional resources to be able to do that. So that is what's called a special fund swap. And there's a basis for doing that. I think all parties agree it makes sense. And so that's one of the ways in which revenue is being saved in a special fund swap. I don't think the full 40 million is there, but that's an example. New revenue, it shows $12 million in new revenue. That's an adjustment of what was the doomsday scenario, in my opinion, in the CIO's budget that showed $40 million less in revenue in this year's budget at the FSR moment, right, when it came out about a month ago, to where current projected revenues are right now. And so there's, instead of it being a $40 million reduction, it's actually a $28 million reduction. So this shows $12 million additional dollars that we believe are there in the new revenue projection. And then there's one-time solutions. And these one-time solutions, right, are going to create some controversy, but I think they're fully justifiable. But what this is refinancing of existing debt. So there's both and it's going to be using what's called corporate paper, which I think is at 0.3%, less than 1% cost. It's a 5-year financing or refinancing of debt. So one of it is about $30 million in debt from the convention center, right, which will be money that, even though the convention center pays for itself in terms of its costs, it doesn't pay for itself in terms of the bonds that have funded the construction of the new convention center. So this is a refinancing of the convention center debt that will allow us to be able to come through with about $28 million to solve our deficit during this crisis period, and it's at less than 1% over 5 years. Right? And the second piece of it, which we're going to resolve through a one-time fix, is a financing of the early retirement program, one-time costs, which also makes sense. I think it's about $20 million. And those are the one-time solutions, which in general, budget people do not like to do. It would be nice if we didn't have to do one-time solutions, but this is a kind of crisis that requires us to do that. And so that's what you're going to see in the mayor's budget as well. And then the final pieces of the conversation are the parts of the conversation that really both Julie and Matt are in a much better position to speak to, which is that, in general, furloughs are ways in which the city, it appears that the city has the ability to impose. It seems that there is some obligation to negotiate on furloughs. There's been some recent court cases on this as well. It's a very active, litigated area as to what cities are allowed to do and not allowed to do, because furloughs in many ways are kind of like, reductions in salaries, or kind of like layoffs, temporary layoffs, right? So it appears that the city has the right to do the furloughs based on recent court cases, although different lawyers would disagree on that interpretation, exactly what that means, right? But in exchange for not doing furloughs, which are a straight up reduction. So 26 furlough days in a year is a 10% reduction in people's wages, right? And that's what we've done for much of this last year, is a 10% cut in people's wages. But there are other ways to structure a solution. And so labor and the city have been talking about better ways to come up with those shortfalls other than furloughs